I'm Gretchen Sinnett. I am an associate professor of art history at Salem State University, where I teach in the art and design department. For the last, I would say, 6 years, I've been working with the Danvers Historical Society on a service learning research project with my students in the arts in America. A shout out to Wayne Eisenhower, the former president of the society, who first invited me to bring students here to research. The exciting thing for me about the program is the Arts in America is part of our general education curriculum at Salem State, which means I get students from across the university. As you might expect, art and design students, history students, but also nursing students, criminal justice, English. So they bring a lot of different perspectives. This also means, though, that most of them don't have experience researching objects, works of art. We work together. The students all write an individual research portfolio on the object they choose, but they also collaborate on finding sources and exchanging ideas. They've been really excited about it. They really like researching objects that they feel have real-world resonance, and they like the fact that their research helps the Historical Society. So I'd like to thank the Historical Society for continuing to work with us. Also, Sheila Cook-Kaiser, who has been my collaborator at the Historical Society and has helped to pick objects, cart them back and forth to the campus so all the students can participate. So this is a 19th century fire bucket. It's an object that I had my eyes on for a couple of years when we were downstairs looking for objects in the collection. It's made of leather with metal rings holding a leather handle, and then the inside, I'll just tilt it a little bit, is likely coated with tar to make it waterproof. The fire buckets were usually made by leather workers. So in Danvers, right, where there was a big shoe industry, likely shoemakers, saddle makers would have constructed them. And so these were used basically to form bucket brigades. And this was the period before there were professional firefighting companies. Also early on, before there were volunteer fire companies that developed by the 1830s. They were usually kept at the entrance to a house, and then also there would be one by each fireplace or hearth. The idea was when there was a fire in the neighborhood, everybody went out with their bucket, either the homeowner, in some cases a servant, and helped to transport water from the source to the fire, and in some cases to a pumping mechanism. Laws were passed during this period similar to the laws we have today, where when you sell a house, you have to have the fire department come and inspect for the smoke and the carbon monoxide detectors. In some municipalities, many actually, there were laws around the number of buckets you had to have in the house, the fact that they needed to be placed by the entrance. So one of the reasons I was attracted to this bucket in particular, because the Historical Society has several in the collection, is that in addition to the text, which we'll talk about, it also had this quite fabulous painting. Most of the buckets did indeed have lettering, and that usually was the name of the person who owned the bucket. Later on, sometimes also the name of volunteer firefighting organizations. And that was so when the fire was out, the bucket could be returned to the owner. They were usually taken to a central location. It also showed who had participated in the firefighting effort. So if you repeatedly, right, your bucket doesn't show up at the fires, then perhaps your neighbors aren't going to be as enthusiastic about helping to fight a fire when it's your property that's in danger. And important to remember that this was a period with wooden roofs, cooking was done on open hearths, and so fire was an ever-present danger in colonial and early national America. In our case, too, two, this case with the beautiful painting shows that this functional object also indicated social class. So it would have been more expensive to have the bucket with the painting. Philemon Putnam, who was the owner of this bucket, his name is here. This bucket advertised the fact that either he or sometimes these were given as gifts, right? So the person who gave it to him was someone who had a certain amount of means and disposable income. And I'm just checking my notes to make sure I share all the interesting things we discovered. So the students' first question was, what was the fire bucket and what was it for? Because for the most part, this was not something that they were familiar with. They also wanted to know who Philemon Putnam was. And so what we found was that he was born in 1789 in Danvers, died in 1867. As residents of Danvers know, Putnam is a very common name, right, in Danvers. He was a ship captain and a merchant, and then by 1829 he had moved to Franconia, New Hampshire, where he served as postmaster and also as a justice of the peace in Grafton County. Later in life he did return to Danvers. The bucket, you can see, hopefully, says active 1825 at the bottom. So that tells us that it was likely created and painted in 1825. So one question I have, right, that we don't really have an answer to was, did he take the bucket with him to New Hampshire and back? Presumably, yes. Students found that he married twice. Unfortunately, his first wife passed away, and he had 5 children between the 2 marriages. They also were really curious about the decoration. So why this decoration? And what it shows is this is the Roman god Mercury, also known as Hermes in the Greek mythology. He's shown flying across a landscape. You can see, I'm just going to slide around. There's water in the background, clouds, a little bit of mountains. The tell that it's Mercury / Hermes is the helmet with the wings, which students initially, a number of them thought it was made them think of a Viking helmet, but the other tell, confirming that these are not horns but wings, is that he also has wings on his feet. And Mercury traditionally was shown with winged sandals. He was the messenger god, and he was a god who was known for speed. And then there's a quite beautiful red drapery billowing in the wind. He has a horn that he's blowing as he flies. One of the decorative elements that I like about this bucket is the way the red of the drapery matches with the red ribbon effect down at the bottom of the bucket. So yeah, right? So why Mercury? It seems potentially a little bit random. And students came up with a couple of ideas, right? We can't prove these. One certainly is that because Mercury is associated with speed, right, this is something you would want with these bucket brigades when you were putting out the fires. Mercury was also a god associated with luck and travel, merchants and trade. And so Putnam, who, like many Danvers residents, was engaged in trade, was a captain. They thought the idea of Mercury on the bucket made sense in terms of his career. Also interesting is that there is a Greek myth involving a character who shared Philemon's name. And so this story involved the god Mercury. Just briefly, Philemon in the myth and his wife Baucis were basically peasants, lived in a village. Zeus, the king of the gods, and Mercury came disguised as poor travelers. They went around to a number of houses seeking hospitality. Hospitality was an important virtue in the ancient world, and they were rebuffed. When they arrived at Philemon and Baucis' house, even though they were not people of means, they welcomed them generously. Because of that, Zeus was angry at the rest of the village, which he destroyed. But they warned Philemon and his wife to leave before that happened, and the couple then became guardians of a temple that was constructed on the spot. So one of my students in particular, shout out to Eli, wondered if Mercury might have been chosen because the Putnams knew about this myth. We didn't really have time to go into this more, and I'll just point out that students only spend one semester researching these objects, which can be quite challenging to research. But I want to look at books of mythology from the time to see how widely known that particular tale was in the United States at the time. We did find in our research one other fire bucket with the same painting of Mercury, although clearly not by the same artist, because the artist who painted the other bucket, which was included on the website of an art conservator, was nowhere near as finely painted. That artist clearly was not as skilled, but the fact that we had two buckets with exactly the same depiction of Mercury suggests that both artists were using a print source, not coming up with this figure right on their own. And that was very common at the time. We weren't able to locate the print, but my guess is it also might have come from an illustration in a book of Greco-Roman mythology. And again, that's something with a little more time we might, and when the library is open again, we might be able to track down that print source. And one of my students in particular, again, shout out to Kevin, was really interested in trying to find that initial source. By the 1830s, so not long after this bucket was created, they start to fall out of use as we get the development of volunteer fire companies and then the professional firefighting service. I can't remember the name, but I'm pretty sure there's a book on with the history of the Danvers firefighting department. Thank you. So these are silhouette portraits created in 1810 of Eliza Putnam, who was 12 years old at the time, and her 10-year-old sister, Emma. Silhouette portraits were a popular and affordable means of portraiture before the development of photography. Compared to an oil portrait, which would take at least several hours of sitting for the artist and were quite expensive, silhouettes of this type likely cost about the contemporary equivalent of $10. So students found an advertisement for a silhouette portraitist who was advertising a silhouette for 50 cents, which would be about $10 today. There were numerous ways of making them. So one was the artist would cut freehand with the scissors, but there also was a machine, and there were several versions of this type of machine called a physiognotrace. So a combination of physiognomy and trace that were used to basically record the person's profile. Profile portraits date back to at least ancient Rome. The sort of vogue for silhouette portraits was likely tied to vogue for neoclassicism in the arts at the time. The silhouette tradition developed first in Europe and then traveled across the Atlantic to the United States. These two are an example of what's called the hollow cut technique. And in that technique, initially it looks like the silhouette artist had cut out the profile from a piece of black paper, but this is actually the reverse. Instead, the white paper was cut, the silhouette was cut out of the white paper, and then that white paper is laid over, in this case it looks to be a black piece of paper. Sometimes they also used fabric. This was the most common technique for silhouettes in the United States at the time. Back to that physiognotrace machine, at some places, so for example in Philadelphia, American artist Charles Wilson Peale had a museum, and at that museum you could pay reportedly a penny to use the machine and basically cut your own silhouette. Sometimes the silhouette cutter would fold the paper over once or twice, and so in that case you would get 2 or 4 copies of the portrait. The frames for these two are quite traditional also. So this is a pressed brass frame. Basically a very thin sheet of brass was embossed, and you can see there are flowers, a vine pattern, a little dot pattern, and then that's laid over a piece of wood. The framing suggests that these were likely done by an artist rather than the girls or their family cutting them themselves. Often the silhouette artists were itinerant. They traveled around from town to town, and they would place an advertisement in the local paper when they arrived. The silhouettes, I think, are really important and fascinating because this is basically the democratization of portraiture. If you've been to the Museum of Fine Arts and think about the fabulous collection of Johnson and Copley portraits there, right? Copley's sitters were pretty much entirely wealthy Bostonians, but this was a form of portraiture that everyday Americans could afford. And that's something that today with our selfies, right, we are surrounded by photographs of ourselves. That wasn't the case in 1810. So students researched the history of silhouettes as a type of art. They tended to be interested in this kind of democratic aspect of the art form, right? That this is something that everyday middle-class people could afford. They also wanted to know about, of course, about the sitters. And this is, again, something I think is interesting about the silhouette portraits, is in some ways for us today, I think they can be a little frustrating, although they still remain popular. Several students told me that when you go to Disney World, you can get a silhouette portrait cut. I didn't remember that. I don't think they had that there when I was a child. But in some ways, they are a type of portrait that seems to provide only limited information about the sitter. We can't really, from the silhouette, get a real sense of facial expression. This is a bust-length portrait. Sometimes they were full-length, but we don't get a sense of clothes or fashion here. We do, I think, get a sense of the girl's age and the fact that Emma, based on her hairstyle, and you can see there were little really delicately cut bangs, and then wisps of hair on the back where she probably, at the ends, probably like a little braid. Eliza at 12 looks like is starting to wear her hair up, and girls' hairstyles during the 1700s and 1800s, right, it transitioned as you matured. So she's starting to wear her hair up. Again, these beautifully cut bangs on them. But we're missing that kind of fuller information. That said, viewers at the time likely would have believed that they could read more into those profiles than we do today. So this was a period of a really popular pseudoscience called phrenology that argued that you could tell people's intellectual capacity, their character, based on their facial features, the shape of their head. If you go to some of the antique stores in Essex and around the North Shore, you might come across little what are called phrenological heads with writing indicating different characteristics. So for example, my favorite one was that if you have kind of a cocked eyebrow, it meant that you were naturally artistic. I will add that phrenology was a pseudoscience that was racist and biased in terms of social class, but pretty widespread at the time. And so people at the time, right, might have read a phrenological guide and then they thought you could tell character, right, based on the profile and based on these facial features. We don't believe that today. So in order to find out more about the Putnam sisters, students had to go on the limited information we had. Now, as you can imagine, particularly if you're from Danvers, right, Emma Putnam, Eliza Putnam, these are pretty common names. Students were using genealogical databases as part of their research, but if you just put in Emma Putnam, you were going to come up with a lot of different women. Fortunately for us, and this is the kind of thing that makes historians and art historians excited, on the back, someone in the family had included information about the sisters. So their name, birth and death dates, and who they married and when they married. And so with that additional information, we were able to start putting together a little bit of information about the girls. One thing I'll point out too, right as I jump around, is that notice that the silhouettes are cut so that the girls face each other. This was common for portraits of married couples, and it clearly suggests to me that these were cut at the same time and as a pair for the family. So what we did find out about the Putnams is that they were the eldest of 12 children of Daniel and Susanna Putnam. I should put my notes here, the details. Eliza married Porter Kettle in 1821, and that was included on the back. And Emma married John Kettle. So very likely brothers. I haven't yet actually found something to nail down that they're brothers. In part, I need to do a little more digging, and what happens with this project is I will continue to do some research when the semester ends and the students leave off. But basically there are variant spellings of kettle, whether there's an E on the end or not. So I need to do a little more digging with the variant spellings. But what we found is that Eliza and her husband Porter had 3 children. First 2 daughters, Lydia, Eliza, named for her mother, and then a son, John, who presumably was named for his uncle. Unfortunately, and this is where I get on my notes and I can't find the date, Eliza died in 1826. She's buried at Holton Cemetery, and buried with her was the son John, who the headstone says died at 9 months. I think he died a couple months after his mother. Tragically, and one of the other aspects I like about this research for my students is, you know, as we do the research, it is a reminder of what life was like, right, in previous centuries. None of their children lived to adulthood. John And Eliza died quite young, and then Lydia, their oldest child, died when she was 11 years old, and she's also buried at the cemetery. Sadly, also, Porter Kettle died in, let me say, 1830. Yes. I did find in the obituaries that he was a captain, so we got a little sense of his career. Going a little bit out of order here. But again, the fact that all the members of this nuclear family, right, died within a fairly short time of the marriage, I think shows students, right, how challenging life could be then and how present illness and death were for these families. I did find, and this is the kind of thing that makes historians excited, and students, a death notice for Eliza. So I'm going to read that to you. It was from the Salem Gazette. It said, "At Danvers yesterday, Mrs. Eliza Kettle, consort of Captain Porter Kettle, and oldest daughter of Daniel Putnam, age 28, whose cheerful and amiable disposition was known only to those who were intimately acquainted with her, and whose tenderness of heart but feebly fortified her against the trying vicissitudes of this life." Yeah, my Sheila, who's on the sidelines, is reacting. So I just thought it was really interesting in terms of the little glimpse into her character. So she seemed to be someone fairly shy and retiring, who maybe was a little bit easily ruffled. Now, the other thing that comes into play here as I thought about this is an idea of a woman being shy and retiring and not in the public sphere, right, was still the dominant ideal in terms of middle class, certainly femininity for white women at the time. So how much of that is actually reflective of who Eliza was and how much of it is influenced and kind of combined with the sort of reigning ideal of proper womanhood at the time is a question I can't answer, but it's a question that interests me. For Emma, Emma lived a much longer life. She lives until 1867. But unfortunately, her husband John passed away in 1827. So she was widowed. I haven't yet been able to kind of find any information on what John's career might have been. Both John and Porter were listed as founding members of the Essex Agricultural Society. So whether that indicates farming, hard to tell. Interestingly, and again, what we find here are sort of tantalizing snippets of information about these people. But in 1836, Emma, who was a widow at that point, won a prize. It looked like to me the prize was $1. From a competition run by the Essex Agricultural Society for a counterpane or bedspread that she had made. And again, being a skilled seamstress, right, would have been seen as one of those desirable traits for a woman at the time. And in another broadcast, we'll talk about some samplers that also connect to that. Both Porter and John appear to have served in a Boston-based militia during the War of 1812. So again, another little bit of information about the men and their families. And also interesting, I found that Emma, along I think with a younger sister, Susan, was for a time the owner of the General Putnam House. So her father, Daniel, left the General Putnam House to his son William, who I think was Emma's brother, in 1854, In 1855, he turned it over, the source had conveyed it to Emma and Susan. And then upon Emma's death in 1867, Susan, it said, became the sole owner. So that suggests to me, and I haven't confirmed this, that the girls grew up in the General Putnam house. Again, kind of interesting in terms of historical societies and how objects make their way here. The silhouettes came up at an auction house and were purchased for the society by donors at auction. And I think that's it. So that's where we are so far on Emma and Eliza Putnam. And hopefully more research by me, by future students, will turn up some additional information about their lives to help us fill in the, we might say, kind of missing information as we look at these silhouettes. This is a collection box from the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society. This was an abolitionist organization connected with the American Anti-Slavery Society. It belonged to Anne Page, and the Page House, which the society is headquartered in, that was Anne Page's home. And we think that it belonged to her and her mother when she was a girl. So just briefly, the Mass Anti-Slavery Society was founded in 1832. Interestingly, women could not become members until 1838. The box was likely made in 1839, and it was meant to promote a weekly contribution plan that the society had come up with. In 1837, there had been a financial panic in the United States. The larger level donors to the society, right, were not able to afford the same type of contribution. And so they developed this weekly contribution plan as a way to try to get donations, smaller donations from a wider range of people. It makes me think, right, of fundraising strategies today. So as part of that, they sold for, I believe, if I remember correctly, it was 6 1/4 penny per box, or you could get a dozen boxes for 75 cents, these collection boxes. But first I'll talk about kind of how the box worked, and then we'll look at a little bit at the imagery and the text. And so the idea was, and there were directions on the back about how you were to use it, that you were meant to set the box on your mantel place or a table that was very obvious in your home. And you were meant to make a donation every Sunday of a penny, 2 pennies, or 6 pennies, depending upon your financial ability. And now I cannot remember, it was the first Monday or the last Monday, I think it was the last Monday of the month, then somebody would come around and collect your donation and deliver it to the chapter offices in Boston. Students, when they were thinking about something similar today, and these were often associated with churches, Protestant churches in Danvers and other areas, thought about collection boxes in churches today. One of the questions I ask students when we're researching these objects is to think about ways in which they seem familiar or they seem foreign in terms of today's society. I certainly thought about when I was a child, we would collect for UNICEF at Halloween in these little paper boxes. And so the idea of the box was literally, right, to be a bank, a place for you to put your money, to collect it, to remind you to weekly make that contribution. But also the imagery and the text were meant to promote the abolitionist cause and to remind you and others why it was important to end slavery and to participate. So on the front is a really iconic image in terms of abolitionist imagery in the United States and Britain of a bound, kneeling slave whose arms and head are raised in prayer. By this period, this image had become basically the iconic imagery used by abolitionist organizations. It was first designed by Josiah Wedgwood for the Wedgwood ceramic manufacturing. There are columns, Corinthian columns here, and then you can see there are manacles, whips, and chains that wrap around those columns, again speaking to the inhumanity of the system of slavery. Rays of sunlight, right, suggesting more optimism. It says here, remember your weekly pledge in the arch above. And I'd forgotten, since we've all been at home, right, how small the text is on this box, right, that I can't read it without a magnifying glass. He said on the back are directions in terms of how to use the box. Again, one of the lines suggests that having it prominently displayed was meant not only to remind you to contribute your pennies, but also people coming into your home to encourage them to contribute to and support the abolitionist cause. On one side is a poem in the guise of a hymn, again talking about abolitionism and the gift of freedom that through your support you would be enabling. And then on the sides, on the top, are biblical verses that were used to argue against slavery. And as you may or may not know, people arguing both, unfortunately, for slavery but also against use the Bible as evidence. And so they have excerpted verses from Deuteronomy from Isaiah that argued against holding others in bondage. One of the questions that one of my students was trying to figure out, and we didn't quite get there, but again, with more time, we might be able to figure out, is he was curious about which congregations in Danvers, I almost said Salem, right, since I teach at Salem State, encourage their parishioners to have these boxes in their home. He said, and we didn't quite get there. But I'm guessing we could figure out probably which church Ann Page and her family belonged to at the time. So this is a print by Richard Ellery called The Clam Digger. It was created in 1938, and it was created when Ellery was working for the federal government as part of the Works Progress Administration during the Great Depression. Ellery's name may be familiar to people. He was a popular Danvers area portraitist. In Tapley Hall, where we're filming this, there are at least 2 portraits by Ellery hanging on the walls. He also was the artist, along with 2 colleagues, of I think 3 murals that are hanging in the Danvers Town Hall. Ellery was born in Salem and moved to Danvers as a child. He was educated at the Mass College of Fine Arts and at the Museum School. So in 1938, when he created this, President Roosevelt had created the WPA to put Americans back to work during the Great Depression. Ellery was one of hundreds of American artists who were paid a salary of $25 a week to create art. WPA is really probably best known today for the murals that these artists created in town halls like Danvers, post offices, libraries across the nation. But artists also created sculptures, easel paintings, prints, and in this case, this is what Ellery was doing. This is part of a series of at least 2 prints. The other one in the Danvers collection shows a fisherman. And I haven't been able to determine yet if there might have been more professions represented. Just a little more background on Ellery. Previous researchers have found that in addition to his work as an artist, he supported his family running a small farm, doing some carpentry. During World War II, he worked at GE as part of the war effort. So students were interested in kind of the question of why is he focusing on the clam digger. One initial question they had was, is this a portrait? Is it meant to represent a specific individual? We decided it's meant more to represent a type. Certainly he would have had an individual man pose for him, but that title, clam digger, the way he shadows the figure's eyes, so we don't really get full access to his face, suggests that he is instead wanting us to see this man as a type. And that's characteristic of also the murals, many of the murals that were painted and created for the WPA. Part of those artists' brief, part of their job was to make images that were inspiring for the American public during this really difficult time. This is characteristic of depictions of male figures, particularly working class figures, in a lot of this WPA art, in that it's really emphasizing his physicality, right? So we have this strong-looking barrel-chested figure. Ellery poses him bare-chested, right? So we can see that anatomy. And we have to remember this was a period of massive unemployment. Traditional measures of masculinity in American society, being that breadwinner, supporting an extended family, were not possible for many men at the time. And many of the WPA artists promoted, we might say, a kind of alternate view of masculinity that emphasized strong physique. Ellery also is heroicizing this figure through his viewpoint, right? So we look up at him. He is a towering figure. Look at the landscape in the background, how low that is, right? It really elevates and makes this figure stand out. One of the questions also that students had was, why a clam digger, right? And why a fisherman? And of course, some of them knew, these were industries which were and are still associated with the North Shore. So students researched Ellery. They also researched clamming and clam digging in this industry and found out some things they thought were really interesting. So for example, they discovered that during the colonial period, clams were not considered fit food for humans. They were used to feed pigs, they were used as bait, and even though there's evidence that the indigenous peoples in the area had been eating clams for centuries, it took a while for clams to catch on as a food. They did find that by the 1840s, clams were included in cookbooks. And certainly by the 1870s and 80s, clams, again here in the North Shore, we particularly think about fried clams, clam chowder, had become really popular. And that coincided with the rise of coastal tourism as people from Boston, other urban areas started to vacation along the New England coast. Some of the students remembered going clamming as children. I would say not many of them were very aware of, or as aware of clamming as a profession. But one thing they did read about was, what backbreaking and physically challenging labor it is to be out there digging clams. One thing that was interesting, and I'm going to try to grab the paired print in a minute, is the pair to this, the image of the fisherman. There's one copy of that print in the collection at the Roosevelt Presidential Library. It wasn't clear from the information I found online whether that was something that Roosevelt had actually owned or that was collected later by the library, because they continued to collect objects associated with the WPA. So I'm going to grab the fisherman. So this is the paired. And again, we see that same viewpoint looking up, the low horizon. In this case, is wearing the overalls and puffing away on a pipe. And again, I would just call your attention to the strength of that figure, the size of those biceps, his hands. And Ellery is presenting us with figures, again, men who appear hardy and strong, placid, we might say, during difficult times. And again, these are images that were meant to be reassuring to the public and to suggest that America would come out of the Great Depression and regain social and economic health. We'll stop here. So this is one of the first objects that I researched with my students. It's a memorial certificate from the First World War. And so what we have is an image of Columbia, the impersonation of the United States, or allegorical representation would be a better description, knighting a doughboy, right, a World War I soldier. Huge billowing American flag, Columbia's shield with the stars and stripes, and then we can see rows of soldiers in the background. There's text at the top which says, "Columbia gives to her son the accolade of the new chivalry of humanity." Down below, also printed, it said, "Served with honor in the World War and died in the service of his country." There's a facsimile of the signature of President Woodrow Wilson. And I will just point out, right, when we talk about World War I, we refer to it as World War I. But this, of course, was printed before the Second World War. Then hand-lettered, you can see calligraphy here. It says Ludwig Carmichael, Private, Battery 301. So this was sent to Private Carmichael's family after he died during the First World War. So questions my students had. So at first they thought that this was perhaps a portrait of Private Carmichael. What they found pretty quickly doing research was that this was a lithograph, so there are multiple copies of this. And these were created to honor, there are two versions of this. They're called Columbia certificates. There's a version for soldiers who were wounded during the war and one for the families of soldiers who died during the war. And this was a precursor to the Purple Heart. These were sent to the families, and a calligrapher added, right, the name and details of each individual soldier. So they established pretty quickly that this was not a portrait. Instead, this is a representation of American soldiers in general. I think one way to think about it is it's similar to the doughboy statues erected in towns across the United States honoring soldiers in the First World War. They were curious also about Columbia, right? And because she's not a figure that we see as often today. Nora, who's filming this, and I were just talking about Columbia Pictures, and the Columbia Pictures logo is probably the best known surviving version of Columbia. I'd like to point out, if you look at Columbia, how strong she is. We were just looking at a print of a clam digger and talking about the strength of the male body, the strength of the female body here. If you look at her arm, her determined gaze. She's wearing what's called a Phrygian cap, which is this kind of conical cap that comes out of ancient Greek traditions. And it basically became associated with liberty in the United States and then also in France during the French Revolution. Marianne, the you might say kind of French version of Columbia, is also often shown wearing that Phrygian cap. Students, of course, were really curious about Ludwig Carmichael, who he was, right, what they could find out about him. And one of the aspects of this piece that I really liked is the way, and all these objects that we research, one of the things that I get really excited about, and I think the students do, is the way they tie into contemporary strands in American society. So, for example, students, we just assumed that Ludwig Carmichael had been killed in battle, right? That was the first thing that came to mind. Students found that he did see service, active service, right? Some soldiers didn't, but that he went to France. But we found that he didn't die in battle. He died in the flu pandemic in 1918, 1919. So unfortunately, Carmichael died after the war ended. He came back with his fellow troops. He was at a base in Long Island where unfortunately he fell victim to the flu and passed away. During the First World War, 40,000 American soldiers died in the pandemic. And as you can imagine, and this is something, right, that's so on the top of our minds today, the close, cramped conditions on the troop transport ships, the close conditions in those army bases were really, unfortunately, effective breeding grounds for the flu to travel from soldier to soldier. Another aspect of the print that I think is interesting in terms of connections with today is that students found out that Carmichael was an immigrant to the United States. He was born in Nova Scotia. He and his mother emigrated to the United States when he was a child, and he was naturalized at Fort Devens before he saw active service. That was part of a congressional act that had been passed a couple months previous in order to facilitate and basically speed up the naturalization of immigrants who were serving in the armed services. So researching this object, students found connections in terms of public health, in terms of the history of immigration in the United States, legal history, right, around how easy it is to become naturalized, to gain citizenship. To see what else I want to share with you. Yes, so the other thing I want to share is if the name Carmichael rings a bell to you as a Danvers resident, that may be because the town of Danvers named a square for him in 1928. I'm not from Danvers, although my mother and my grandfather grew up here. But there is a memorial plaque at the corner of Maple and Forest Streets in honor of Ludwig Carmichael. And in May of 2017, the town put up a new plaque. So that's something, if you're traveling around town, to keep your eyes open. I did find, so, trying to find, Mr. Trask, the town archivist, Richard Trask, found some information on Carmichael. And he wrote that Carmichael was a well-known and well-liked resident who went to Holton High School, and that he was a pitcher on the baseball team. Students found, based on his draft registration card, that in 1917 he lived at 38 Forest Street, and that he was employed as a farmer by somebody named Charles Preston. So a little bit of information about his life before he entered the military. Blatchfield, the artist, so the print was designed by a really well-known American artist at the time named Edwin Howland Blatchfield. And there's just a little text here that said designed by E.H. Blatchfield in 1919. Blatchfield was someone who started locally. He went to the Boston Latin School and then studied at Harvard and MIT. Interestingly, he graduated with a degree in civil engineering rather than art. Blatchfield was one of many American artists who created, basically write propaganda posters encouraging Americans to support the war effort, to buy war bonds. And he's best known, though, as a muralist. There are murals by Blatchfield in the Library of Congress, and then also at educational institutions like MIT and also at Bowdoin College. My last information is, let's see if I can find it. I want to make sure I get the name right. Here we go. Hopefully they can edit out these gaps. If this figure of Lady Liberty looks familiar, that could be because she is the emblem of the Disabled American Veterans Organization, which was founded in 1921. And they got permission from Blatchfield to use, I believe it was from Blatchfield or his heirs, to use his version of Columbia as the symbol of their organization. And so you can see that, I believe, still on their website and some of their materials today.